There was a boy named Samir who lived in a small town at the edge of a wide brown river, and everyone in the town knew two things about him. He asked too many questions, and he never stayed where he was told to stay. His grandmother, whom he called Nani, always said, "Samir, one day your curiosity will drag you somewhere your legs cannot carry you back from." And every single time she said this, he would smile and say, "Then I will crawl back, Nani." And she would shake her head and go back to stirring whatever was cooking on the stove. It was the summer before Samir turned 13, and that summer was hotter than any summer the town had ever seen. The river dropped so low that rocks and mud that no one had ever seen before were now sitting in the open air like old bones coming out of the earth. And the fishermen could not fish, and the farmers could not water their crops, and everyone in the town walked around with worry sitting heavy on their faces. But Samir was not worried. He was excited, because where everyone else saw a disaster, he saw an adventure. Where the adults saw a dying river, he saw a world that had been hidden under the water for longer than anyone could remember. Every morning after breakfast, he would walk down to the riverbank and explore the newly exposed ground, stepping carefully over slippery rocks and cracked mud, looking for anything unusual, anything that did not belong. And on the 7th morning of his search, he found something. It was sticking out of the mud near a large flat stone that had strange marks carved into its surface, marks that looked like letters from a language Samir had never seen before. And the thing sticking out of the mud was small and dark and shaped like a key, but not like any key he had ever seen in his life. He pulled it free with a soft sucking sound, and he held it up in the sunlight and turned it slowly. It was made of some kind of metal that was black and cold, even in the blazing heat of the day, and it had tiny symbols running along its handle that matched the symbols on the flat stone. His heart was beating fast, and his hands were shaking just a little, and he looked around to make sure no one was watching him before he slipped the key into his pocket. That night at dinner, Nani noticed that he was quieter than usual. She put her hand on his forehead and said, "Are you sick?" And he said, "No, Nani, I am just tired from the heat." And she looked at him the way she always did when she knew he was not telling the full truth. But she let it go. After dinner, when Nani was asleep in her chair with the radio playing soft music, Samir took the key out of his pocket and examined it under the lamp in his room. The symbols on it seemed to shift and move in the yellow light, and he told himself it was just his imagination. But deep inside, he was not so sure. The next morning, he went back to the flat stone by the river. He knelt down and brushed away more mud with his hands. And as he cleaned the surface of the stone, he realized it was not just a stone. It was a door, a large square door set into the ground, and on one side of it there was a small hole that was exactly the shape of the key in his pocket. He sat back on his heels and stared at it. His mind was racing with questions. Who had built this door, and when? And why was it under the river? And what was behind it? And should he open it? And what would happen if he did? He looked around again. The riverbank was empty. The nearest houses were far away, and the only sound was the thin trickle of what was left of the river moving slowly over the rocks. He took the key out of his pocket and held it over the hole. His hand was trembling, and a voice in his head that sounded a lot like Nani's said, "Samir, do not open that door." But another voice, his own voice, the voice of the boy who asked too many questions and never stayed where he was told to stay, said, "You have to know what is down there." He pushed the key into the hole. There was a deep clicking sound, like the bones of the earth shifting, and then a low rumble, and then the stone door began to slide open, grinding against rock and dirt, revealing a set of stairs going down into darkness. Cold air rushed up from below, and it smelled old and strange, like metal and wet stone, and something sweet that he could not name. The stairs were made of the same dark stone as the door, and they were smooth and worn, as if thousands and thousands of feet had walked up and down them a very long time ago. Samir stood at the top of the stairs and looked down into the darkness. He could not see the bottom. He could not hear anything coming from below. There was only the cold air and the strange smell and the silence. He should have gone home. He should have told Nani. He should have told someone, anyone. But he did not do any of those things. Instead, he took one step down, and then another, and then another, and the sunlight behind him grew smaller and smaller until it was just a bright square far above his head. And still he kept going, his hand pressed against the cool wall of the stairway, his feet finding each step in the growing dark. He counted the steps as he went, 20, 40, 60, 80, and at 100 steps his foot touched flat ground, and he stopped. He was standing in complete darkness. He could feel open space around him, big open space, like he had walked into a cave or a huge room. And the air was still and cold, and the silence was so deep it almost had a sound of its own. And then something happened that made his breath catch in his throat. Far ahead of him, deep in the darkness, a small light appeared. Just a tiny blue glow, no bigger than a firefly, floating in the black air, and then another light appeared next to it. And then another, and then another, and soon there were dozens of small blue lights, spreading across the darkness, like stars waking up in a night sky. Samir stood perfectly still, and watched as the lights grew brighter, and began to reveal the shapes of things around him, walls, and columns, and arches, and streets, and he realized with a shock that made his knees go weak, that he was not standing in a cave at all. He was standing at the entrance of a city. A whole city, underground, beneath the river, hidden from the world above for what must have been hundreds, or maybe thousands of years. And it was enormous, stretching out in every direction as far as the blue light would let him see. "What is this place?" he whispered, and his voice echoed off the stone walls and came back to him changed, as if the city itself was repeating his question, asking it back to him. "What is this place? What is this place? What is this place?" He did not have an answer, but he knew one thing for certain. He was going to find one. Samir walked forward slowly, and with every step he took, more of the blue lights came to life around him, as if the city could feel him moving through it, and was lighting his way like a host guiding a guest through a grand house. The buildings on either side of him were tall and made of smooth, dark stone, and their walls were covered with the same strange symbols he had seen on the key and the door. The streets beneath his feet were paved with flat tiles that had been laid so perfectly that not a single one was out of place. Even after all the years they must have been sitting here in the dark. He reached out and touched the wall of the nearest building, and it was cool and dry under his fingers, and he could feel the carved symbols like tiny rivers running under his hand. Everything was in perfect condition, as if the people who had lived here had left only yesterday, and not centuries ago. But there were no people. The city was empty, silent, still. There were no voices, no footsteps, no signs of life anywhere, just the blue lights glowing softly from the tops of the buildings, and the deep quiet that filled every corner and every street. Samir walked deeper into the city, turning left and then right, following the widest street, which seemed to lead toward the center. And as he walked, he began to notice things that made him stop and stare. There were fountains built into the walls, dry now, but beautifully carved with figures of animals and people. There were benches made of polished stone sitting along the sides of the street. There were doorways with arches above them that were decorated with patterns so detailed and so delicate that they looked like lace made of rock. Whoever had built this place had been brilliant. They had been artists and builders and dreamers, and they had created something that was more beautiful than anything he had ever seen above ground in the regular world. He came to a wide-open square in what seemed to be the center of the city, and in the middle of the square stood a tall structure that looked like a tower. It was made of the same dark stone as everything else, but it was covered from bottom to top with the blue lights, and they pulsed gently, getting brighter and then dimmer, brighter and then dimmer, like a heartbeat. At the base of the tower, there was a large door, and on the door there was another keyhole, the same shape as the key he was carrying. Samir's hand went to his pocket, and he felt the key there, cold and heavy. He looked at the door and the keyhole and the pulsing blue lights, and he felt a pull in his chest, like the tower was calling to him, asking him to come closer, asking him to open the door and step inside. But before he could move toward it, he heard something, a sound that made him spin around and press his back against the nearest wall. Footsteps. Someone else was in the city. The footsteps were coming from one of the streets that led into the square, and they were getting closer. And Samir's heart was hammering so hard he was sure whoever was coming could hear it echoing off the stone walls. He crouched behind a fountain and held his breath, and he watched, and after a moment, a figure stepped into the square. It was a girl about his age, maybe a year older, with short dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catch the blue light and hold it. She was wearing a school uniform that Samir recognized as belonging to the government school on the other side of town, and she was carrying a small backpack and a flashlight that looked ridiculous and weak compared to the blue glow of the city around her. She stopped in the middle of the square and looked around with an expression that was not fear and not surprise, but something more like recognition, as if she had been here before, as if she had been expecting this place to be exactly what it was. "I know you are hiding," she said suddenly, and her voice was calm and clear, and it bounced around the square like a stone skipping on water. "I saw your footprints in the mud at the top of the stairs, and I have been following them since I came down, so you might as well come out." Samir did not move for a long moment. He was trying to decide if this girl was dangerous or just annoying, and he decided she was probably just annoying, so he stood up slowly from behind the fountain and stepped into the open. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Zara," she said, looking at him with those sharp eyes. "And the better question is, who are you, and how did you open the door? Because I've been trying to find a way into this place for 2 years." "2 years?" Samir said, and his voice cracked a little with surprise. "2 years," she repeated. "I found the stone door last summer when the river was low, but it was locked, and I could not open it. I came back every time the water dropped. I studied the symbols. I read every book I could find about ancient cities and lost civilizations, and I still could not get in. And then today, I came to check the door, and it was open, and there were muddy footprints going down the stairs, and here I am." She crossed her arms and looked at him the way a teacher looks at a student who has given a wrong answer. "So, I will ask again. How did you open it?" Samir reached into his pocket and held up the key, and Zara's eyes went wide. She stepped forward quickly and reached for it, but Samir pulled his hand back. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, and for the first time her calm expression cracked, and he could see excitement and hunger underneath it, the same kind of curiosity that lived inside him, the kind that burned like a fever. "I found it in the mud near the door," he said. "It was just sticking out of the ground." "That is impossible," she said. "I searched every centimeter of ground around that door. I would have found it." "Maybe it was not there when you looked," Samir said. "Maybe it only comes out when the time is right." Zara stared at him, and then she laughed, a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it. "You sound like my grandfather," she said. "He used to tell stories about a city under the river, a city built by people who lived here before anyone else, before history, before memory. Everyone thought he was crazy. and when he died last year, I found his notebooks full of drawings and maps and research, and that is how I found the stone door." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a worn leather notebook, and she opened it and showed Samir pages filled with drawings of symbols, the same symbols that were on the key, on the door, on the walls of the buildings all around them. "Your grandfather knew about this place?" Samir asked. "He spent his whole life trying to find it," Zara said, and her voice was quieter now, softer. "And he died before he could, and I promised myself I would find it for him." They stood in the blue-lit square and looked at each other, and Samir felt something shift between them. They were not strangers anymore. They were two people standing in an impossible place, sharing a secret that no one else in the world knew. And that kind of secret creates a bond that is stronger than years of friendship. "There is a door on that tower," Samir said, pointing, "and it has a keyhole that matches this key." Zara looked at the tower, and the blue lights pulsed, and she looked back at Samir. "Then we should open it," she said. "We do not know what is inside," Samir said. "No," she agreed, "but not knowing has never stopped either of us, has it?" And she smiled for the first time, a real smile, and Samir smiled back, and together they walked toward the tower at the center of the city, beneath the river. Samir pushed the key into the keyhole on the tower door, and once again there was that deep clicking sound, that feeling of something ancient waking up, and the door swung open with a low groan that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. Inside the tower, the blue light was brighter than anywhere else in the city. It came from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling far above their heads, and it moved like water, flowing and rippling across every surface. The air inside was warmer too, and it hummed with a low vibration that Samir could feel in his chest and in his teeth. "Do you feel that?" Zara whispered. "Yes," Samir said. "It feels like the tower is alive." They stepped inside together, and the door did not close behind them, which was a relief, because Samir had been worried about exactly that. The interior of the tower was one large round room, and in the center of the room there was a raised platform made of clear crystal, and on the platform there was a book. It was not like any book Samir had ever seen. It was large and thick, bound in a material that looked like leather but was darker and smoother, and its cover was decorated with the same symbols that were everywhere in this city, and the book was glowing, softly, gently, pulsing with that same heartbeat rhythm as the blue lights outside. Zara moved toward it first, her eyes wide, her hands reaching out. She was breathing fast, and her face was lit up with the kind of wonder that makes a person look both very young and very old at the same time. "This is what my grandfather was looking for," she said. "He wrote about it in his notebooks. He called it the memory book. He said, the people who built this city had a way of storing their knowledge, their history, everything they knew in a single book, and whoever could read it would understand everything about who they were and why they built this city and why they disappeared." "Can you read it?" Samir asked. "I do not know," Zara said, "but I have spent 2 years learning their symbols, so maybe I can understand some of it." She reached out and touched the cover of the book, and the moment her fingers made contact with it, something extraordinary happened. The blue light in the room exploded outward, filling every corner with brilliance, and the symbols on the walls began to move, swirling and rearranging themselves, and images began to appear in the air around them like ghosts made of light. Samir grabbed Zara's arm, but she did not pull her hand away from the book. Her eyes were closed, and her face was calm, and the images in the air were becoming clearer and clearer. They were seeing the history of the city. The images showed people, thousands of people, building the city with their hands, and with tools that Samir did not recognize. They were brown-skinned and dark-haired, and they wore simple clothes, and they worked with a kind of joyful energy that was visible even in these ghost-like projections. They carved the stone, they laid the tiles, they built the fountains and the arches and the tower, And they did it all underground, beneath the river, hidden from the world above. Why? Samir said out loud. Why did they build underground? As if the book could hear him, the images changed. Now they showed the world above the city, and it was a world of war. Armies marching, villages burning, people running and screaming and falling. Invaders were sweeping across the land, destroying everything in their path, and the people of this region were being hunted and killed. And so they went underground. They took their families and their knowledge and their art and their music and their stories, and they dug deep beneath the river where no one would think to look, and they built a new home in the dark, and they survived. The images showed their life underground, children playing in the blue-lit streets, people working and laughing and eating together, artists painting on the stone walls, teachers standing before groups of young people and pointing at the symbols on the walls. They had created a complete world down here, with everything they needed, and they had lived in peace for what looked like many generations. They were incredible, Zara whispered, and her voice was thick with emotion. They saved their entire culture, their entire people, by hiding it under the earth. The images continued to flow, and now they showed something that made Samir's stomach tighten with worry. The blue lights in the city began to flicker, and the people in the images began to look worried and afraid. Something was wrong. The energy that powered the city, whatever it was fading, and the people did not know how to fix it. Meetings were held in the square outside the tower. Leaders spoke, arguments broke out, and the fear on people's faces grew deeper. The city was dying, slowly, and they had to make a choice. Stay underground and hope the lights would come back, or leave the city and return to the surface and face whatever was waiting for them up there. The images showed a long and painful debate, families torn apart by disagreement, some wanting to stay and some wanting to go. And in the end, the city split. Half the people stayed underground, and half the people climbed the stairs and went back to the surface. The images showed the ones who left emerging into sunlight, blinking and shielding their eyes, stepping into a world that had changed since they had gone underground. The invaders were gone, new people lived on the land, and the ones who came from beneath the river had to start over, had to build new lives and new homes, and slowly, over time, they forgot where they had come from. They forgot the city. They forgot the symbols. They forgot the book. They became the people of the town, Samir's town, and they never went back. "We are them," Samir said, and the realization hit him like cold water. "The people in our town. We are the descendants of the people who built this city." Zara opened her eyes and looked at him, and there were tears on her face. "Yes," she said, "my grandfather believed that, and now we can see it is true." "But what happened to the ones who stayed?" Samir asked. The images in the air changed one final time, and they showed the people who had stayed underground, growing fewer and fewer as the blue lights grew dimmer and dimmer. And then the lights went out completely, and the images stopped, and the room was quiet, and neither Samir nor Zara spoke for a long time. "They are gone," Zara said finally. "Maybe," Samir said, "but the lights are on now. We turned them on when we opened the door, when we used the key. That means the energy is not gone forever. It was just sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up." Zara looked at the book, and then she looked at Samir, and he could see the same thought forming in her mind that was forming in his. This city did not have to stay hidden. This history did not have to stay forgotten. The people of their town deserved to know where they came from, who their ancestors were, what they had built, and what they had survived. "We have to tell someone," Zara said. "Who would believe us?" Samir asked. "No one," Zara admitted. "Not unless we bring them down here and show them." And that was when they heard the sound, a deep, low rumbling that came from somewhere below them, from somewhere beneath even this underground city. And the ground shook under their feet, and dust fell from the ceiling, and the blue lights flickered wildly. "What was that?" Samir said. Zara grabbed his arm. Her face had gone pale. "The river," she said. "I heard on the radio this morning. There is a dam upstream, and they are releasing water today to try to raise the river level. If the water rises, the entrance to the stairs will be flooded." "How long do we have?" Samir asked, and his voice was steadier than he felt. "I do not know," Zara said. "Maybe hours, maybe less." They looked at each other, and they looked at the book, and they looked at the door of the tower, and they both understood that they had a choice to make. Leave now and save themselves, or stay and try to learn as much as they could before the water came. Samir picked up the book. It was heavier than he expected, but he held it tight against his chest. "We take it with us," he said. "We take it and we go, right now." Zara nodded, and together they ran out of the tower and into the blue-lit streets of the city beneath the river, running toward the stairs, running toward the surface, running against the sound of water rushing somewhere in the dark. They ran through the streets of the underground city, and the blue lights seemed to understand their panic, because they pulsed faster now, flickering urgently, as if the city itself was telling them to hurry, to run, to get out before it was too late. Samir held the memory book against his chest with both arms, and it was heavy and awkward and slowed him down, but he refused to let go of it. This book was the voice of an entire people, the record of a civilization that the world had forgotten, and he would rather drown than leave it behind in the dark. Zara ran ahead of him, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand, even though she did not need it. She seemed to know the streets better than he did, turning left and right without hesitation, and he followed her, trusting her sense of direction, because his own was useless in this maze of stone and light. The rumbling sound was getting louder, and now they could hear something else beneath it. The sound of water, moving fast, echoing through tunnels and passageways somewhere below them. The river was coming, filling the underground spaces, rising like a hungry animal swallowing everything in its path. "Faster!" Zara shouted over her shoulder, and Samir pushed his legs harder, his lungs burning, his arms aching from the weight of the book. They burst out of the narrow streets and into the wide avenue that led to the staircase, and Samir could see the square of daylight at the top of the stairs. Far above them, small but beautiful, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. But between them and the stairs, the ground was wet. Water was already seeping up through cracks in the stone floor. Thin streams of brown river water, it spread across the tiles like fingers reaching for them. The water was not deep yet, just ankle-high, but it was rising fast, and the sound of rushing water was now so loud that Samir had to shout to be heard. "Go, go, go!" he yelled, and Zara splashed through the water and reached the bottom of the stairs and started climbing, taking the steps two at a time, and Samir was right behind her, his wet shoes slipping on the smooth stone. They climbed, 20 steps, 40 steps, and below them the water was rising, chasing them up the staircase like a living thing. Samir could hear it gurgling and splashing behind him, could feel the cold spray on the back of his legs, and he climbed faster, his thighs screaming, the book in his arms feeling heavier with every step. At 60 steps, Zara stumbled and fell forward, catching herself with her hands. She cried out in pain, and Samir saw that she had cut her palm on the edge of a step. Blood was running between her fingers, bright red against the dark stone. "Get up," Samir said, and he grabbed her backpack strap with one hand and pulled her to her feet. She winced, but she kept climbing, holding her bleeding hand against her chest. At 80 steps, the water caught up with them. It rushed over their feet, cold and brown and full of mud, and it was rising fast, already up to their shins. Climbing through rising water was like climbing through a nightmare, every step harder than the last, their legs fighting against the current that wanted to drag them back down. "We are not going to make it," Zara shouted, and for the first time Samir heard real fear in her voice. Not the controlled calm she had shown in the city, but raw, animal fear, the kind that lives in the deepest part of the brain. "We are going to make it," Samir shouted back, and he did not know if he believed it, but he said it anyway, because sometimes the only thing standing between a person and giving up is a voice that says, "Keep going." At 90 steps the water was at their waists, and climbing was almost impossible. They were half swimming, half crawling up the stairs, and the square of daylight above them was getting closer, but not close enough, and the water was getting higher and higher. Samir made a decision. He shifted the book to one arm and grabbed Zara's hand with the other. "Together," he said, and they pulled each other up the stairs, step by step, the water roaring around them, their heads barely above the surface. At step 95, Samir felt the water stop rising. It held steady at his chest for a moment, and then, slowly, it began to drop. Not much, just a little, as if the river had taken a breath and was deciding whether to inhale again. "Now!" Zara screamed, and they threw themselves up the last 5 steps, scrambling and splashing and gasping. And they burst out of the stairway and onto the muddy riverbank, and collapsed in the hot afternoon sun, coughing and spitting water and shaking so hard they could not stand. Samir lay on his back in the mud, and held the memory book above him, water dripping from its covers, and he laughed. A wild, breathless, half-crazy laugh that was more relief than joy. Because they were alive, they were above ground, and they still had the book. Zara rolled over and looked at him, her hair plastered to her face, her bleeding hand leaving red smears on the mud. "You are insane," she said, and then she laughed too, and they lay there in the mud and laughed until they could not breathe. When the laughter finally stopped, they sat up and looked at the place where the stone door had been. It was gone, covered by the rising river water, invisible again, hidden beneath the brown surface as if it had never existed. "The city," Zara said quietly. "It is flooded now." "The lights will go out again," Samir said. "Yes." They sat in silence for a long moment, and the weight of what had happened settled on them like a heavy blanket. They had found an entire city, an entire lost civilization, and now it was under water again, and they might never be able to go back. But they had the book. Samir looked down at it, resting in his lap, still glowing faintly even in the bright sunlight. The symbols on its cover seemed to shimmer and shift, and he could almost feel the knowledge inside it. Thousands of years of history and wisdom and memory, pressing against the covers, waiting to be read. "Can you translate it?" he asked Zara. She took the book carefully and opened it. The pages were thin and smooth, covered with the strange symbols, and they were completely dry, even though the book had been soaked in river water just minutes ago. "Some of it," she said, her fingers tracing the symbols on the first page. "My grandfather's notebooks have translations for about a third of the symbols, and I have figured out more on my own. It will take time, but yes, I think I can translate it. Maybe not everything, but enough to understand the important parts." "We need a plan," Samir said. "We cannot just walk into town and say we found a lost city under the river. People will think we are liars or crazy or both. My grandfather was called crazy his whole life for believing in this city," Zara said, and her voice had an edge to it, sharp and hard. "I will not let that happen to us. We need proof, real proof, the kind that no one can argue with." "The book is proof," Samir said. "The book is proof for us," Zara corrected. "But for everyone else, it is just a strange old book with weird writing. We need to translate it. We need to document everything. We need photographs of the city. We need to go back." "Go back?" Samir said. "Zara, we almost died down there." "I know," she said, "and I am not saying we go back tomorrow. I am saying we wait for the next time the river drops, and we prepare properly. Lights, ropes, waterproof bags, cameras, everything we need. And in the meantime, we translate the book, and we learn everything we can." Samir looked at her, and he saw the determination in her eyes, the same fire that must have burned in her grandfather's eyes, the same hunger for truth that had driven him his whole life, and that now lived in his granddaughter. And Samir felt that same fire inside himself, because he was the boy who asked too many questions, the boy who never stayed where he was told to stay. And this was the biggest question he had ever asked. Who were the people who built the city beneath the river, and what had happened to them? "All right," he said. "We do it together." Zara held out her uninjured hand, and Samir shook it. And in that moment, in the mud on the bank of a dying river, they made a pact that would change their lives and the life of their entire town forever. They did not know that yet, of course. They did not know that the book would reveal secrets far bigger and far more dangerous than they could imagine. They did not know that there were others in the world who were looking for this city, powerful people who would do anything to find it. They did not know that the key in Samir's pocket was more than just a key, and that the city beneath the river was more than just a city. All they knew, sitting there in the mud and the sun, was that they had found something extraordinary, something that mattered, and they were not going to let it go. Samir put the key back in his pocket and felt its cold weight against his leg. And Zara held the book in her arms, the way a mother holds a child, and together they stood up and walked away from the river, leaving wet footprints in the dry earth behind them. The days that followed were the busiest and strangest of Samir's life. Every afternoon after school, he would walk to Zara's house on the other side of town, and they would sit in her grandfather's old study, surrounded by his notebooks and maps, and they would work on translating the memory book. The study was a small room at the back of the house, with one window that let in dusty yellow light. The walls were covered with papers, drawings of symbols, maps of the river, photographs of old stones and carvings, and it smelled like old books and tea and the faint sweet smoke of incense that Zara's mother burned every morning. Zara was the translator. She had her grandfather's gift for languages, and she could look at a page of symbols and find patterns and meanings that were invisible to Samir. She would sit with the book open on her lap and a notebook beside her, and she would work for hours, writing and crossing out and writing again, her forehead creased with concentration. Samir was the organizer. He took everything Zara translated and put it in order, building a timeline of the underground city's history, writing down names and dates and events, creating a map of the city based on the descriptions in the book. He was good at seeing the big picture, at connecting pieces that seemed unrelated, and together they made a team that was stronger than either of them alone. Weeks passed, and slowly the story of the city took shape. The memory book was not just a history. It was a record of everything the underground people had known and created. It contained descriptions of their engineering techniques, their art, their music, their system of government, their medicines, their way of growing food underground using the blue light. It was an encyclopedia of a lost civilization, and every page they translated revealed something new and astonishing. "Listen to this," Zara said one evening, her eyes bright with excitement. They had a council of 12 leaders, 6 men and 6 women, and every leader served for exactly 12 years and then stepped down and became a teacher. No one could serve longer than 12 years, no exceptions, ever. "That is a good system," Samir said. "It is a brilliant system," Zara corrected. "And look at this. They had schools for every child, and every child learned reading and writing and mathematics and art and music and building and healing. There was no separation between boys and girls, no separation between rich and poor, because underground there was no rich and no poor. Everyone shared everything." The more they translated, the more they realized that the underground city had been more advanced in many ways than the world above it. The people who had built it were not primitive or backward. They were sophisticated and creative and wise, and they had been forced underground not because they were weak, but because the world above them was violent and cruel. And then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Zara translated the part of the book that changed everything. She went very quiet, and she read the page again, and then she looked up at Samir with an expression he had never seen on her face before. It was shock and wonder and fear all mixed together. "Samir," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "The city is not dead." "What do you mean?" he asked. "The book says that the energy source of the city, the thing that powers the blue lights and everything else, it is not a machine or a fire or anything like that. It is the river itself. The city was built to draw energy from the flow of the river above it. And as long as the river flows, the city can come back to life." "But the lights went out," Samir said. "We saw it in the visions. The lights failed and the people had to leave." "Because someone blocked the connection," Zara said, reading from the book. "The last entry in this section says that before the people left, the leaders sealed the energy channels to protect the city from outsiders. They locked everything down, and they hid the key, the same key you found, and they said that one day someone would come who was meant to find it, and that person would have the choice to wake the city up again. Not just the lights, Samir, but everything. The water systems, the food-growing chambers, the air purifiers, all of it." Samir sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The weight of what Zara was telling him pressed down on him like a stone. The key in his pocket suddenly felt different. Not just heavy, but alive, important, dangerous. "Someone was meant to find the key," he said slowly. "You were meant to find the key," Zara said. "That is crazy." "Is it?" Zara asked. "You found the key in a place I searched 100 times and never found it. It appeared when you were there, for you. And you are a descendant of the people who built the city. We both are. This is not random, Samir. This is something that was planned a very long time ago, by people who were smart enough to build an entire city underground." Samir stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the rain falling on the streets of his small, ordinary town. He thought about Nani, asleep in her chair every night, about the fishermen who could not fish and the farmers who could not farm, about the crumbling school and the broken roads, and the young people who left town every year because there was nothing here for them. And then he thought about the city beneath the river, the beautiful buildings, the perfect streets, the technology that could grow food and purify air, and light an entire underground world with nothing but the flow of a river. "If we could wake the city up," he said, still looking out the window, "really wake it up, make everything work again, what would that mean?" Zara came and stood beside him. "It would mean that our town is sitting on top of the most important archaeological discovery in history," she said. "It would mean that the knowledge in this book could help people, not just our people, but everyone, the engineering, the energy technology, the farming techniques. This civilization figured out things that we are still struggling with today. And it would mean that our people would finally know who they are," Samir said, "where they came from, what they are capable of." "Yes," Zara said, "it would mean all of that." They stood side by side at the window and watched the rain, and neither of them spoke for a while, because some moments are too big for words, and this was one of them. It took them 3 more months, 3 months of translating and planning and preparing, 3 months of sneaking supplies to the riverbank and hiding them in a waterproof box they buried in the mud. 3 months of learning everything the book could teach them about the city systems and how to restart them. And then the next summer came, and the heat returned, and the river dropped again, and the stone door appeared in the mud, like an old friend waiting for them. They went down together on a bright Saturday morning. They had ropes and lights and waterproof bags and cameras and enough food and water for 2 days. They had maps they had drawn from the book's descriptions and a list of every step they needed to take to restart the city's energy systems. The key turned in the lock. The stairs appeared. The blue lights woke up as they walked down, and the city greeted them the way it had before, with silence and beauty and that low hum of something waiting to come alive. They worked all day and all night. They followed the book's instructions and found the energy channels that the ancient leaders had sealed, and one by one, they opened them. Each channel was a stone valve set into the floor of the city, and each valve needed the key to open it. And each time Samir turned the key, the city grew brighter and louder and more alive. At midnight, they opened the last valve, and the city exploded with light. Not just blue now, but gold and white and green, a rainbow of colors that poured from every building and every wall and every street. And the fountains came to life, and water flowed through them for the first time in centuries, and the air filled with a sound that was almost like music, a deep harmonic tone that resonated through the stone and through their bones. Samir and Zara stood in the central square and watched the city wake up around them, and they held hands because they needed to hold on to something real, something human, in the middle of all this wonder. "We did it," Zara said. "Your grandfather would be proud," Samir said. "He is proud," she said, and she smiled through tears, and the lights of the city danced in her eyes. They spent the next day taking photographs and videos of everything, every building, every street, every symbol, every fountain, every working system. They documented the food chambers, where strange plants were already beginning to grow under the lights, the water purification pools, where river water was being filtered through layers of stone and sand, the air vents that pushed fresh air through the city in gentle currents. And when they climbed back up to the surface, muddy and exhausted, and carrying the memory book and cameras full of evidence, they knew that nothing would ever be the same. It took time, more time than they wanted. There were phone calls and emails and meetings with professors and archaeologists and government officials, and there were people who did not believe them, and people who tried to take credit, and people who wanted to exploit the discovery for money. But Samir and Zara held firm, and they told the truth, and they showed the evidence, and eventually the world listened. The city beneath the river was not just a discovery, it was a revolution. Scientists came from everywhere to study the energy systems and the farming technology and the engineering. Historians rewrote their books. The people of the town learned who they really were, and they stood taller, and they spoke louder, and they stopped leaving. Nani cried when Samir told her the full story. She held his face in her hands and said, "I always said your curiosity would drag you somewhere your legs could not carry you back from." And Samir smiled and said, "You were right, Nani, but it also carried me exactly where I needed to go." And deep beneath the river, the city of their ancestors glowed with light that had waited 1,000 years to shine again, patient and beautiful and alive, like a heart that had never stopped beating, only paused, waiting for the right hands to wake it up.